I will be presenting my talk. We need an open source phone operating system, Postmarketers. My name is Luca Weiss. I'm working as a software engineer at Fairphone, which is a Dutch brand to make sustainable mobile phones and some other products. In my free time, I'm also a Postmarketers core contributor and working on infrastructure side there a bit. And I'm also maintaining the OpenRazor project on the side. Just to be clear, these are my opinions. While I'm here like half as Fairphone employee, yeah, this is not a Fairphone talk, but it's my talk about this. You can also find me on Mastodon, and my website's also linked there. So to start off with we basically have a duopoly for mobile operating systems. So we have iOS, which runs on iPhones, which are only produced by Apple. And then we do have Android, which is used by various manufacturers. So between Fairphone and probably like 100 other brands or more. And basically all of the Android phones that are shipping commercially are shipping with Google Play services, which means you get the Google Play Store to get your apps from. Because this is really expected by the vast majority of customers. If they don't know where they would get their apps if they weren't available, if there was no Play Store available on the phone, and also a lot of the Android apps that you could install do depend on having the Google Play services available. Otherwise, the apps probably don't work. And by all of these Android phone manufacturers shipping Google Play services, they're also then required to follow Google's policies and requirements to make, which on a positive side, make sure that there's some minimum requirements are followed. So for example, some security things. So like if you're shipping an update, a security patch level can't be older than X months. And it makes sure that actually all of the Android apps, all of the Android APIs are compatible with what they should be, because the way how Android builds are built basically opens up the possibility to kind of break everything. So CTS, the compatibility test suite from Google, makes sure that this is actually working properly according to their specifications. But of course, by actually being bound by Google's requirements there, you're a company that ships phones with Google or with Android also has way less independence in what they can do, because they need to really follow whatever Google is imposing on them. And also it does require, of course, to have a business relationship with a US company, which currently is no problem at all, but also for different countries, and who knows if the US will have any export sanctions or whatever, or if just Google decides to not want to do this anymore. I mean, it's definitely possible. Google and Apple essentially control the whole phone market, and there's no other alternative really, no viable commercial alternative. And yeah, this is a problem on different fronts. We definitely have the privacy implications. A good example, in my opinion, is Google Photos, which is pre-installed on I think all of the Android phones, and it's the default gallery app for a lot of them. And when you disable the photo backup and don't want to sync all of your photos to Google Cloud, then like weekly or monthly, I'm not quite sure, you get like a pop-up that's saying, please enable, your photos are not getting backed up. Oh no, please enable backup so your photos are safe. And of course the toggle is on by default, and if you just want to quickly click through it, then suddenly all of your photos get synced to Google. There's also a lot of independence issues, let's say. Google is really controlling Android. It is open source, it's Apache 2 licensed, but it's essentially what Google throws over the wall. You can technically contribute changes to AOSP, to the Android open source project, and they may get accepted, but actually getting your changes accepted, especially some features that maybe don't quite align with Google's interest, there's no chance of ever getting them accepted. Google is also heavily starting to restrict certain things, so like installing apps, which they call sideloading, they want to enforce that only verified developers, where they need to register with Google, actually you cannot install apps which are made by, let's say, unverified developers, and it's really restricting the end user in the end. And there's also the concerns that whether Android will actually stay open source. So for example, for the Android 16 QPR1 update, they have published the source code, and then, they've published the update, and then like a few days later, when the source code would have normally appeared, like it just wasn't there. I think like after a week, Google was saying, yeah, we are working on it, and we'll keep you posted. And I think in the end, after only 2 months, the source code was actually published for the QPR1 update. So whether they will continue to push sources, I hope so, would be good. But I mean, there's no guarantee because it's Apache 2 license, and yeah, they can just do whatever they want, essentially. So there's also a lot of proprietary code then shipping with basically all of the phones. So you can't have there is no phone shipping with 100% open source software with an Android build. There's also, I will talk about it in the next slide, there's also definitely on every smartphone, like even if, let's say all of the Android stack will be or would be open source, including all of the board support, there would still be like proprietary modem firmware and everything. But yeah, this is a problem. And then, of course, software updates with Google requiring to certify every single Android update. It takes quite some time, and it restricts you quite a lot in what companies or what you can use essentially in the end. So what is Android actually running on? So Android is essentially the user space, and is running on a Linux kernel, which is normally quite heavily modified, but it's still a Linux kernel. Linux kernel is of course GPL2 licensed, so it means that every binary build of a Linux kernel needs to have the corresponding source code published, which basically means all of the kernel-related parts that are shipping on Android phones need to be open sourced. In theory, there are some modules that don't interact with GPL, like they're not considered a derivative of the Linux kernel. So basically, what the NVIDIA proprietary driver or ZFS or something is doing. So it technically does exist, but essentially all of the drivers that are relevant, they are open source. But yeah, in these kernels that are shipping on Android devices, usually the interfaces are not following the, let's say, Linux standard interfaces. Where then user space could easily interact with this, which also requires a bunch of custom work on the Android layer to make it work correctly. But yeah, so Android and Linux is actually only running on like a small part of the SoC, so the system on a chip. So there's also the GPU. There's different other co-processors which all run also basically between a firmware and an actual operating system, which is proprietary. So for example, for Qualcomm, they have their own CPU architecture for a lot of the chips. And on most devices, you can actually, it's, let's say, physically impossible to actually boot a custom firmware on these other CPU processors because it's secure boot signed. So you can actually only boot firmware that is signed by the manufacturer, which has their public key burned into the fuses of the SoC. But even for some devices where this is not enforced because secure boot is turned off, nobody, as far as I know, has ever implemented like a open source alternative for example, the modem or the ADSP cores, which are on these SoCs. So quickly talking about third-party Android ROMs. So I'm sure a lot of you know about LineageOS and EOS and CalyxOS and a lot of other Android distributions or Android ROMs. And yes, in general, they are more open source than stock operating system because all of the Android layer, including all of the customizations, everything is open source. So you can build it from source yourself. You can modify it easily, and you can boot it on your devices. But yeah, this build from, for example, LineageOS, it's still far from 100% open source. Because a lot of the proprietary bits from libraries and binaries from the original Android operating system are getting imported essentially as is, and then are getting used with this third-party Android build. which is required to make a lot of the things work. So for example, the GPU driver and some modem interfaces and a lot of other components which are in between Android and the Linux kernel, they are proprietary. And there's, as far as I know, not really any effort to replace them in terms of the Android ecosystem there. And of course, there's also, when you take all of these proprietary binaries from the stock operating system, you are also reliant on the stock operating system to actually supply security updates, for example. And when a device is end of life from the manufacturer, then yeah, you can maybe take some binaries from a related device and maybe do some binary patching and stuff. So there's a lot of, let's say, workarounds for using proprietary software in there. And of course, all of these third-party Android ROMs, they're also dependent on Google actually publishing the source code. If Google stops doing this or is delaying the source code release by 2 months, then they also, of course, cannot ship any update with that. So then I will go into PostmarketOS, which this talk is mostly about. So the tagline is the Linux distribution for mobile devices and beyond. And essentially, the aim is to make a fully open source operating system for phones mostly. So actually having all of the user space open source and of course also the kernel space, and making sure that we can actually, that the foundations are laid to actually then support devices for a long time. Because we're using the upstream kernel and not a fork of the Linux kernel, which is super old. So actually being able to keep the software up to date and everything there. And making sure, if everything's open source, then you can actually update all of the components in there. And if there's an incompatibility, you can actually fix it without any big issues. So in PostmarketOS, we try to make only very limited device-specific adaptations there. So currently, for most devices, there's still a device-specific, essentially rootfs and boot image that you build. But we're also working on making this a bit more generic and actually being able then to have the rootfs be one generic rootfs and then only have like basically the kernel plus some other configuration be device specific. PostmarketOS is a completely independent project and is based on donations. So we are using the donations to fund the infrastructure costs and to have some hackathons to actually work on together, and for example, have some stuff for the FOSDEM conference where we're always present. PostmarketOS is based on Alpine Linux, which is a Linux distribution that you may know from Docker containers or something, or from the more the embedded space. It was used since the beginning, and it has been quite a reliable base to be on. And one of the nice features that you have with PostmarketOS is you actually get a package manager, so you can install packages as you would on a Linux laptop, for example. So you can install everything that you would ever want. Essentially, that's in the package in the package repositories. And if there's something that's not, you have a compiler and you have the build tools and just build it yourself, no problem. So PostmarketOS is then providing essentially on top of Alpine Linux the tooling. So we have the PM Bootstrap tool. We have some extra packages, especially these device packages that are, let's say our configuration. Build infrastructure to actually build them, to build the packages and build some images that people can easily flash. And we also have a wiki where we have a bunch of documentation there, where we are hoping that this is helpful for people to work on. So I was mentioning, so the Android, essentially all of the Android devices are shipping on a fork of a Linux long-term support release, which are then usually, they're at least historically, they're never updated. They're based on, for example, the 5.4 release of the Linux kernel, and then that's it. And the device is supported for like 3 years, which is then covered by the Linux LTS life cycle, and then the device end of life anyways. So then you're stuck with this old Linux kernel version with like millions of lines of code added and modified compared to the upstream version of Linux. In Postmarket we are really focusing on using the upstream kernel. So actually taking the newest kernel.org release of the Linux kernel and then putting some, trying to get all of the changes that we need for specific devices, actually getting those changes upstream. But yeah, for most devices we still have like between, let's say 10 and 100 patches or something. But yeah, a lot of people are working also to upstream those to get less of a diff between upstream and make it easier to rebase on new Linux kernel releases. Of course, yeah, then because you're on the latest Linux kernel version, you can just stay up to date with whatever's happening in the Linux kernel. So be it new file systems or new features in the Linux kernel, there's a lot of things there happening there that are actually really cool, and there's no reason why you wouldn't want it on your phone as well. And for example, staying on a super old kernel version forever just doesn't work because operating system, like the user space, different components, just start requiring new kernel features at some point. So systemd doesn't work on a 3.4 kernel anymore, but does require some new kernel version because they just said, yeah, this version has been like 10 years old and we just don't support it anymore because there's no point to it. And also Docker and everything else is also likes to use new kernel features. The LTS releases, even though they're most of the time supported for 6 years, probably be a bit less in the future or something. But yeah, they're definitely not maintained forever. So if you want to if you want to keep maintaining the device for longer than 6 years and have it actually be secure from the kernel perspective, you actually need to upgrade to a new kernel version. And with the downstream kernel, it's just not really feasible to take all of the changes that were done there by the original manufacturer and actually port them to the new version. So actually starting from scratch, let's say, on the upstream kernel actually makes way more sense there. And of course, if you are already based on quite a recent kernel version with only a limited amount of patches, you can just quite easily update to a new version to be able to do this. And of course, you can also then easily test and release candidates, for example, or Linux Next, and actually make sure that new releases of Linux don't break existing devices. And find regressions and stuff. There's also sometimes the question, like, why are we actually not reusing Android parts? So some operating systems like Ubuntu Touch especially, they are taking the Android bits and actually packaging them up in a way with some translation layer to actually be able to use the Android components. So for example, the Android camera HAL, be able to use them on a Linux user space and then be able to interface with, let's say, regular Linux software with this and actually call into these Android user different libc, the Bionic libc, and actually be able to call from glibc into binaries that are compiled against this Bionic libc. It's called libhybris. But yeah, so there's some very practical reasons for doing this because you can then just rely on the original manufacturer providing a good camera HAL that actually makes good quality photos, for example. But of course, at the same time, you're still dependent on the Android parts. You're still dependent on proprietary software. You're dependent on sometimes a bit flaky layer between the Android components and the Linux components. And in my opinion, it just doesn't, doing this also just doesn't encourage the development of native solutions like libcamera, what we had in the previous talk, or replacing any other proprietary component in the system with open source. And if you start with only open source software, you build it from the ground up, and you make sure that that everything's covered there. And of course, for example, in Postmarket, the camera quality for devices that do have camera support is quite limited currently, and it's nothing compared to what you can get from Ubuntu Touch, for example. But what we hope to get to a, let's say, acceptable level, and actually always be using 100% open source software. What is Postmarket actually like right now? It's definitely not a finished product in any sense. This slide is also mostly anecdotal evidence. We don't really have any hard numbers. We sometimes see messages on social media, or we talk to people at conferences, but we don't have any analytics or stuff like this. But we definitely do know that some people are actually using PostmarketOS as a daily driver on their phone. So they don't use Android on this phone, but only PostmarketOS. But at least some of them also carry like a secondary phone, for example, for phone calls, or for having their banking app on there, because of course, yeah, because banks are quite annoying with a lot of app requirements. We do actually have quite a lot of supported devices. So in the community category, which is like basically the best supported category for phones, we have 111 different devices. And we also have another 342 different devices in the testing category, where it is anything between it barely boots, and you can probably get an SSH session into the phone, to basically or nearly everything is working, and you could consider it to be at least usable for quite a lot of different use cases. So at least for watching some YouTube on your couch or stuff like this. And we also have another 250 ports in the downstream category, where they are using the downstream kernel, which historically we've only had downstream kernels, but fortunately since over the years we have shifted quite the focus, because also when PostmarketOS started there was barely any phone support for in the upstream kernel, and by now you have essentially what is now nearly 450 different devices which are supported in some way with the upstream kernel. And yeah, PostmarketOS is definitely not ready for the average user yet, for the average person, but I would say it's definitely ready for the average hacker. So people who actually want to mess with computers and want to work on it and want to play around with it. And it's definitely ready for this even on most of the testing devices, because yeah, you get an SSH session into the phone, and then you can do fun things with the phone. Also, like if you look at the PostmarketOS wiki, for example, on a specific device page where we have listed what features of a device actually do work. So, for example, if the camera works or if the speaker works, we have some check marks there, but essentially they're more saying that it's functional. So, like it technically works, but in a lot of cases there are still some stability issues, or it doesn't work all of the time. And it's a bit different whether you boot up the device once and then you test if the camera opens, and yes, you get a camera stream, or whether if you actually have the device in standby for 5 hours and then have it booted since 2 weeks, and whether then actually the camera is still open. So if the camera opens actually reliably every time. I did have a talk about this at FOSDEM 2025, where I talked about this quite in detail, so you can take a look afterwards. And yeah, stability is definitely lacking still on basically all devices, unfortunately, but a lot of these areas are also actively getting worked on, and we're trying to get, for example, some audio reliability improvements going there. Yeah, so there's a lot of plans for the future, obviously, in PostmarketOS. But yeah, since we're volunteer-driven, there's not like a concrete roadmap that we have and where we can promise, yes, within 6 months we will have this or this working. But there's definitely a lot of things happening, and if you read, we do have monthly blog posts about the progress and the things that have happened in PostmarketOS. And you can definitely check them out to get like a feeling for what's actually going on. And it's actually, yeah, there's really a lot going on. And if you compare it with, for example, like only 2 years ago or 1 year ago, it is significantly different to what is actually working on a lot of these devices. Yeah, so like what can you actually do with PostmarketOS today? So like with all of these, let's say 450 devices that we had before, and probably also all of the most of the downstream devices. So you can definitely install it on the phone. You probably have a phone in your drawer, an old phone, or you can pick one up secondhand for probably like 20 euros or the equivalent amount of in yen. And it's probably, yeah, since we have a lot of devices supported, it's probably easy enough to get one that actually works with PostmarketOS, and you can boot it up and then try to hack on it. And if you, there's a lot of different things to do with it, of course. So we also do have a main category actually, but there I think currently we only have the QEMU images because we if we like once we get a device where we can actually say this is good enough to actually use as a phone, and we actually put in the main category, but so far we only have in the community and testing. And yeah, of course, you can run the phone then with a GUI, for example, so with Plasma Mobile or Phosh or GNOME Mobile or Tiling Window Manager type thing, which is called SXMO. So like if you like i3 or Sway, you will be quite at home with SXMO, for example. You can of course also run the phone headless, so without any UI applications on it, and run server-side stuff on it. So I mean, it's Linux. You can run Docker containers on it. You can run Kubernetes. You can make a cluster from different phones together. You can plug in different devices via USB most of the time. You can host a web server. There's, for example, the website compose.party, which is run on a solar-powered old broken phone, which is lying around somewhere, and then you have a website running on there. Or you can build a media playback tablet with PostmarketOS and get things running there. There's also some projects going on to like make a sort of music production or like musical instrument based on old phones. So like there's a lot of really creative ways to use it, because it gives you a Linux environment on a mobile phone, which is one of the main points. There's a lot of ways how you could help out and how we could really use some help. So essentially, most of the useful contributions is actually doing upstream work. So whether you're doing some kernel development, so actually enabling more hardware on existing devices or bringing up completely new devices, or just doing general base kernel work. It's of course important. There's a lot of middlewares like libcamera and FeedbackD. FeedbackD is doing it's interfacing with the haptics, for example, and the LEDs on a device to be able to do this. For the mobile phone UI, so like for Plasma Mobile or for Phosh, they're also looking for developers to improve the user experience or implement new features that you really want to see on your Linux phone. There's a lot of apps running on there's currently a limited amount of apps running on the mobile form factor. A lot of the GNOME apps are actually built using libadwaita, where basically the desktop app can also scale down to work on a mobile phone. So by improving the mobile, let's say the mobile app, you're essentially, I mean, it's the same app as on the desktop. So for GNOME Maps, for example, it's exactly the same app, just on a smaller screen, essentially. So most of this stuff you can also develop in your desktop and improve in your desktop, and it will automatically help us by having better apps available. Of course, you can also maintain some packages in the Alpine A ports, where most of the packages that we depend on are in there. With as in non-PostmarketOS packages, we really only have a really limited set of packages in the PMA ports repository for PostmarketOS, apart from the device packages and everything. But of course, we are also really looking forward to contributions from non-developers. So there's also a million ways to help out there. From just trying on your device, if you're tech curious, I'm sure you can manage to install it on your device, follow the documentation. And of course, if the documentation is not clear enough, then please tell us. And if you can, improve the documentation. And write down your experience. Also doing translations for all of the apps, and of course, is really useful, especially for Japanese speakers. I'm sure that there's quite a lot of translations missing for Japanese and for many other languages. Talk about it on conferences, present at non-technical things about it, and make sure that people know about it. We do have monthly blog posts, as I said. They take quite some effort. So if some people really like writing and composing and layouting and stuff, this would be amazing. We do have a podcast. Recently, we have a few less episodes because of lack of time of people willing to edit it and being the people willing to organize it. And there's also a lot of funding grants available in the world. But these also take quite some effort in writing grant applications, making sure that like even or finding the grants in the first place and writing the grant applications and following up and everything and trying to make sure that the people who actually could use that gets to that money and be able to actually spend more or less full-time time on this. Also, for example, Phosh, so like the one of the UIs that is available. A lot of this work is being sponsored by funding grants. So I think a lot more could be done with funding grants, but there needs to be somebody to actually help out there. We also have a web page, postmarketers.org/contribute, where you can also find some more stuff. And also, if you have any other ideas how people can help out, with an email address here, we can email us and tell us about it. That's it. And if there's any questions, I think we have some time.
Hi. First of all, congratulations on the talk. I found it really refreshing, I think, to have such an approach to technology, especially because I find it that currently we're trying to move forward and really forgetting about that technology that keeps being left behind. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of permacomputing. I find it quite a great topic to delve into. And a question I have is, are you, as a community, more focusing on newer devices or currently just trying to reach older devices as well? Where are you normally exploring more, into the newer devices or into older technology?
So, I mean, most device ports are done by, let's say, random people from the community. A lot of these people, I think, are doing it on a spare device, so probably their old device. Like, if they get a new device, they can then start working on the old device and develop some software for this. So generally, it is, from my feeling, it is like devices that are a few years old already, where then people start contributing to that. Since I do have some time at my day job at Fairphone to actually work on postmarketers or like mainline kernel support for Fairphone devices. So there, I'm usually on the I'm even working on it before the device is actually launched to be able to already have at least something available there. So I'm personally working on a few new devices, but also I'm still maintaining the Fairphone 2, for example, which is from 2015. So it really depends on who is working on it. But there's also devices still like the Nokia N900 supported in there, so which is, I think, now certainly more than 10 years old. So yeah, everything between super old and really new. For Alpine Linux, you do ARM v6 with some floating point extension or something at least. But like any ARM v7 plus device will work, essentially.
Great, thank you.
I know you work for Fairphone, so it's probably a tricky question. Is there a golden device? If you wanted to get into this thing, is it something like a PinePhone, Fairphone? Is there anything off the top of your head you'd suggest?
So definitely in the past, we always recommended the OnePlus 6 and OnePlus 6T, which were quite well supported. But now the devices are also getting a bit old, so it's not the, let's say, the flashiest one, and it's also, at some point, it also starts getting trickier to get on the second-hand marketplace. The Pixel 3a is also quite well supported. And from the self-plug, the Fairphone 5 is also, apart from a few crucial features, is also quite well supported there. And there's also some, but there's a lot of devices. You can check we have a nice wiki page with like an overview of all of the devices in the community category, with like a nice, essentially, table with like green check marks, and you can see like what would actually fit best for what you would need. So, for example, if you want a device with NFC, where actually NFC is working, it gets quite a bit more restricted to what devices you can use.
Since you mentioned the early Linux contributions for the Fairphone 6, is it in pole position to sort of become or exceed the support of the Fairphone 5?
The Fairphone 5 had some advantages because there was already some work going into the SoC that it's based on from Linaro and Qualcomm and Google in the past. Unfortunately, the Fairphone 6 does not have any of this going for it. So currently, it's me who's doing all of the SoC support for it. And on Fairphone 5, I was already able to start with a lot of these things already supported. And some Qualcomm engineers were also then contributing some support for this SoC. So I don't expect the Fairphone 6 to be anywhere or not to come close to Fairphone 5, at least not in the next 1 or 2 years, because I also have just limited time in my day. And I'm also, of course, still trying to expand on the work that's going on to the Fairphone 5 and Fairphone 4 also. So, for example, recently got the cameras working on Fairphone 4. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So last month, an engineer at Google posted patches for the Pixel 10 on the mailing list or something, like just very basic patches. You know what is that about?
For what?
For the Pixel 10, the newest Pixel.
Ah, okay.
So an engineer at Google just posted like a device tree and a few other like basic patches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, so the start to upstreaming any devices essentially are just working on a bare minimum and then expanding on that. I don't know any details about also the Pixel land really. Since Fairphone devices are all Qualcomm except for the Fairphone 1, like I'm mostly involved in the Qualcomm side of things, and I don't know much about the Tensor and like what the status is there, unfortunately.
Okay.
But yeah, ask this person directly, like send them an email if you want to know more. Any more questions? Any more hands? If not, I will be around for the day, so come find me if you want. If you have some more questions and want to talk to me. And yeah, thanks for being here.